그래서 저기 상당 신라 되바다 다신라 마되바 랑왕도 주바니디 가와레스 지나다 신라 되제 신실 되네 주바이나 내 강라마되바 랑왕도 랑근근 주바데 용고 말레스 매반자다 되네자다 최근에 지메이네야 신실라 되네 주바 자자차되거레스 신라 마되바 주베 랑근근 주바요 말레스 지나다가 저电竞 제외 주에 남샤파 심주체도 지지를 되는电주진도 되는 띵기도 심주체도 되네 강라에 마되바랑 뭐는 주바 자오기는 민도 선배게다 동방이 또 별로디 기그레스 다 동방이 또 별로디 개바이나다 동방이 또 바이나 아니 아주에 소소라랑 기다 자주 셈냠네 제하다 아니 지소 파시르고 냠네 제발라 아니 닝도 플락바도 개하다 아니 제 셈잖아 미비게 동아자도기 니제다 안자말로 소바기야다 심제 탐지교 돈도 능이 샬레 팜버투긴 세비게 라선담다 개발라야 아니 니제 라고 가서 니도다 안되니게 네 팜바기야지 라버트기 투고레스 된자 동반이 또별로 공바이나 또바이나 아니 디데네 아니 지게 개회 초봉 호시우지 아니 랑귤라 야 냠내 림바디게 야고시우시용 투고레스 다들이 쇼가도 되네 직 어시로와
Good afternoon. This morning we looked at the relationship between dependency and something being dependent and something being independent. And it's important that one comes to recognize that despite phenomena appearing to us as being independent, they cannot exist in this way, but rather they are dependent. Because we can understand quite easily intellectually that these two are contradictory, something being dependent and independent. We need to integrate this within us and approach the meditation from both perspectives, recognizing that if something is dependent, it is therefore empty of inherent existence. Likewise, if something is empty of inherent existence, it is a dependent arising. I come to recognize that all phenomena are dependent. There's not a single phenomenon that is independent, and therefore all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. In relation to the strength of that realization, we will have a courageous outlook, a determination to fulfill the potential of this realization, the complete eradication of the afflicted minds, in particular the root cause, ignorance of self-grasping. Realizing that liberation from suffering is possible, and having that realization conjoined with our consecutive cultivation of love and compassion, our determination to become a Buddha for the sake of others grows ever stronger. In this way, our bodhicitta aids our progression towards enlightenment. Moreover, with understanding of emptiness, this too strengthens our determination to spiritually evolve for others. So these two working together in harmony, the wisdom realizing emptiness and bodhicitta, both will grow in strength as we strive with ever more determination to accumulate virtue and to do so in accordance with the wisdom realizing emptiness. In other words, to engage in both the method side and the wisdom side together or in harmony.
Tine zadang jugi nyom berik sem de sha kongro nga ya sa tisine ane gyudan kin de den me ba su tugo re har se kin de nyembo da me ba to be dong ba yi de be shero gong ba la tine ane nga jugi gyar zhang ji sin da sin de ma me ba su ya dan de la tine ane nyom de sha kongro nyom ma su ma ge ba je tine an ge yu cho jam ni je jan ju sem komche dus komyo de chiso parji nyamne che de ngazu sem de gewe sem chode ene ngo gone go de pyeche ane tarbata tamche sanje ko pa to 두고 res 제상고 라신 마주바 인자 디 ane 데네게 두고 res 용 두고 라신 주바이나 다 간라에 마되고 그런 건 죽되바 있나 규어다요 마스티네 녀모디 예나 가제 여베나 메바스 투야요 말씀 당보 간의 쉐베나 데다가스모드 텔레 야게 당투야요 말레스 제자다 라신용 고심 최 간데시나 라신 마주바 인장 신 뛰네 주바레 뛰네 주반자 신실을 뛰네가 주기 균이 리티기 마 메바스 투야다 연대 리티 양아주 공원에 페투야 돼 안지 두고래 해야지 안디 대신 쇼게 된데 중으로 디셰르와.
Moreover, this morning, I pointed out that the consequence of all phenomena being dependent and no phenomena being independent in relation to our own minds, this consequence is that our afflicted minds that torment us and cause us pain and suffering, being dependent, we can eradicate them. Not being independent, we can eradicate them. And similarly, all our good qualities, whatever wisdom we have cultivated as well as minds of love and compassion, these too are dependent arisings. They are not independent. And therefore, they can be developed ever further. And by habituating ourselves ever more to the virtuous class of minds, in relation or in dependence on that habituation, proportionately, our habituation to the afflicted class of minds will weaken. And this means, as we apply ourselves ever more to method and wisdom, cultivating love and compassion, the wisdom realizing emptiness, not only do these two classes of virtuous minds aid each other through mutual dependency, they also serve to weaken the afflicted minds. And as we become ever more habituated to virtuous ways of thinking, vast stores of merit is accumulated, and we progress towards the attainment of Buddhahood, and the complete eradication of all faults, and the perfection of all good qualities.
Digun rawa me bade deni dani yoma yins.
Returning to the text, to the third quote on page 15, and this is from Aryadeva's 400 verses. Whatever exists dependently is not independent. As everything lacks independence, consequently, there is no self that exists.
Donda de jing zu shoge sheba na jigbare za da shung ka gare ma do da gang la tin ni jung yue ba se de ni rawa mi gyu ro se de da ji na de ji shoge sheba na gang la de ni ben de xian jie ga ri le de ni ben de ngo bo ri gi na gyu dan jian xian jie le de ni zhu yue ba ngo bo men bai na xian jie le de ni yong gu yue bai na gang la de ni jung gu yue ba ji xian jie le de ni zhu gu yue ba yin na ani de ni rawa mi gyu se de Gala Matuba Rawadi, Yumares. Is a change is around Shanchilla Tuni Tubada, Gala Matuba Rawani body, Gavares. Chizayana, Shella Tuni Tubana, Rawan the Chagmara, Rawan the Tubana, Shella Tuba the Yumares. Tenza Gala Dini Junior Bass, Ganga, she Gala Dini Junior, Jumbi, Mubiri, Check, and the Shimbena. Teso, Shella Tuni Tubadi was. Tuni Tubanza, Denig. The
meaning of this verse is the same as what's been presented above. It's just another source to make it abundantly clear that what has been presented in our text is in accordance with the great masters of former times. Looking at the first two lines, whatever exists dependently is not independent. We can see very clearly that if something is dependent, it cannot be independent. And the converse is also true. If something were independent, it couldn't be dependent. So all phenomena are dependent arisings. And therefore, no phenomenon can be independent.
Tene Jungorua, Sajua, Benangan Ludi, ne, Ludi, Dangas Rakwas, sometimes Ludi Rakwadi, Ludike, and then Azuki, Pamala Dine, Pamala Dine Junguba, Shanla Dine Jungubare. The Zanda Shanla Dine Yombaza, Rang Ludi, Pamala Dine Jubayanza, Pamala Shanla Matuba, Rawan Sadi, Mabare. Sezan Pamala Dine to Pamamena, Manzulu to Yomares, Sezan Diniki, Rawan. Dinashi, Maranzo Sem said in air, Manazuki Kawalas and Rang Semdi, Rangu Lula Din and our Sem Jungo, Rangu Lula Din, Yupache. That Coron, that same Corona, Rangi Gu Namala Din, Junguyoba, Rangi Gu Namala Din, Junguyoba Chiche, and the young Chitensa Rangu Lula Din, Yobache. And the same said, Yachi Coro usually, usually dinner, you seem to shower, you made the same shire, Marwaches, then it's a same setting, same said, you le depa, Rangi Tim Pumbola depa, and the Chigi, Rangi Gu Namala depa, on the Ducian Shanshil depa, to the Rangi Lula, same condition as Shala dinner to bury, Shala depa Jubaza, Rangi Lula, same, and then Ha said again. Gala Yamato Rang said so in the Yomara. Rang Rang Lucia Yomara, Rang to Rang Luyame, Rang to Rang Semyame, Rang to Rang Ma said the Gansati Yomare, Mayam Yomare such. The thing you run to Zugmenas in Dirwa, not to Lula Tindra. Chesa Gansa said the Ranga said Nga Rawan Yomares. Just a nga setting out to Lule Tin Shan le Dugores, Rangula Dugores. Just a Ludia, Rawan, Lucia, your mother, Nga said Rawan, Nga, Rawan, Semia, me, just a Chassa Shan le Dugores, dinner to go there, such.
Whatever exists dependently is not independent. This certainly is the case with our body. Our body is very, very much is greatly dependent too. And we can point just to our parents and say our body cannot be independent because we acquired this body in dependence on our parents. If we didn't have parents, we wouldn't have a body. And we could, of course, point to so many other causes and parts, as well as imputation that's required for this body. Our mind too is dependent. Our mind is dependent on the body, our mind is dependent on prior causes, and our mind, or each mind, is dependent on having an object. So mind too is dependent. It cannot be independent. But not only is our body dependent and our mind dependent, so too is the person. The person is also dependent on mind and body, for example.
Dine za dang zuge dishi shoge sheba na yire nga zu lu da sem na chaza shen le rangwang me ba za rangwang ma zhu ba za rangwang de zhu de ba na lu de rangwang de zhu de ba na lu de gywa da me ba de wa ane sem rangwang zhu de na sem ne gywa da yo ko ma de chaza nga se de rangwang zhu de na nga gywa da yo ma de me gywa da me na dang zu sem je ne ge di na sem je je de ma de sang ye cha ta ba to ya me di gan 차고로와 아디나시 디니 인자다 라왕 메바인자 샹라 뛰네 주바인자 나 저기 샘도 교왔다야 요래 나 세도 교왔다야 나 저 류디야 교왔다야 이래 말이야 제가 교왔다야 이래 봐자 다 교왔다야기 가르를 때는 교왔던 것은 아 저기 냠는지 쇼게 동바 디신 쇼게 시야게 동바니 또 별로디 공발할 때네 나 저기 샘도 교왔다 안에 저게 뇨모베리티 마음에 와서야다 내 잠이 이제 공부할 때네 말아주기 안에 샘디야 상비 철이야 교왔다 다샘 그런 교왔다 저도 류디야 교와신 로고랑 아주 류디야 교와주고 봐 제가 류디 교연 탐제단 파 샘디 교연 탐제 제제 샘디 야야 저도 류디야 라신 거 교연 마 세제 안에 이 야야 주고 봐 되네 잠 되네 저도 류다 샘디야 yarge kutodo de nga sere kansa dia ko yar 두고로 봐지자 디니기 셈기 때도 gyön 차상 빵제 아니 윤된 차상 누벼도 ngadia ane sanjo ko to bare sa chi shi nga sanjo ngaji sanjo ko sangye songre sa chi dos chen yung go ba dine za chi za ra shi rang ma ju wa za din de ju wa din de ju wa za ane nga de su ju wa da je ane ya ge da ye ba re sa chi.
The body, the mind, the person, like all phenomena, are dependent. If the body or the mind or the person or any phenomenon were independent, it could not change. But being dependent means that they do change in relation to others, for example, causes, parts, etc. Because our body, mind, and the person are dependent, they can change, and they can change in dependence on the causes we accumulate, and therefore we can spiritually develop to the point of perfection, the point of Buddhahood. If our body, mind, the person were, if the person were independent, the person could not change, and as a sentient being, we would always remain a sentient being. Buddhahood would be impossible. But that, as we're seeing, is not the case. Through cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness, we can transform our mind, first weakening and eventually eradicating the afflicted minds. Moreover, through cultivating love and compassion, we can develop a good heart, a completely different outlook. This too comes about because our mind is dependent. And then through the development of our mind, the transformation of our mind, this has an impact on our body. And the body, because the body and the mind are interrelated. And therefore it shows again how the body is not independent, but is dependent. And through our development of our mind, this has an impact on the body. And this process of development continues all the way through the various stages and paths until the eventual achievement of the state of perfection, enlightenment. And all of this is possible because no phenomenon exists independently or inherently or by way of its own nature, but rather is dependent on other phenomena. And therefore, transformation is possible.
Digun rawa me bade dine dani yue ma yin sidu digun sidu da ngang zu chi da nang gu ngo bu che tham je chi nang gu che kan de chi ne ya chi nang che kan de chi ne yue bi rik che kan de chi ne ya de za rawa xian gang lai ma do rang wen ne du ba rawa sa di min do as rawa me ba yin za da de na rawa me ba de chi za xian rawa me ba de me ba za xian ne due ne du go de se di za da rang去其他人去干那些，然后没办法点呢，那你越嘛也设定啊，设大设定，然后就比大设定越嘛的设计。
The verse concludes, as everything lacks independence, consequently there is no self that exists. All phenomena, whether it's outer or inner, all phenomena, everything that exists is dependent. Nothing is independent. Nothing exists by way of its own nature or essence. Everything is dependent. And as the text says, consequently, there is no self that exists, meaning there is no self that exists independently.
Rāngwāng mē bā xiān lé tuñ nē chūpa rē sē chī, xiān lé tuñ nē chūpa sā rāngwāng yō mā rē sē tē zō rūp xiān lé kō tēn chēn chāwā chūwa xiān chī lé tuñ nē chūpa rē sē tēn tē kē nām yā xiān tū dī kīm chēn jī dā rāngwāng sē tē yō mā rē sē shī kī rōwa. Tē sā tā ngā dzō rākpa sam tāng bē nē ngā dzō kī tā ngā dzō sam tā nē nga ju sabon ro nyugu de ye na sabon le tene gewa sabon da an chu da lu da me na nyugu ji ge me ba de nga ju se ba go to go ba de de ra ba ji an de ne ma je nga ju lu de ne an de pa da ma le tene shan le tuen de ju ge ba an du che ne nga ju ju to go ba an de nga ju ge sem ne ne nga ju ge Lobsang Dorje xin ya ri di nie le ya jiang du che ba la de ne lobsang de xie ge ba xie bi ge lo de ya ge zhu ge ba de ne ge ra ba de yang a ju ge duen de zhu ba de ha gu de go la ji san de ne xin ne du che xim ju chen ba ga de xim ju che be na che san xian ji le duen de zhu de ba yang ma do ji san duen de ma zhu ba se de zao ge de ni ge me ha ma ro de xian le duen de zhu ba yang da ma du che ra ban ma che cha ma ji 참모 될 제배나 뛰는 주바 파 되니 뛰는 뢰파 다바 좀 여바를 차용 그래요. 되니게 마도 신 되니게 가 통고 말와 되니 매바지 통고 말 랑문의 줍되바 여바이나 파 강라 마도바 랑문의 줍어 여바나 파 제니 파 제제 심주제도 띠녀고 봐. 띠 균이에 매래 진짜 많이 봐지 띠는 주바 짱짱 통요도 제가 강라에 마도 랑문의 주바디 민두 선배기다 로타 줘바디 용거로 봐 진짜 동반이 세 도배 로디 타 줘바디 도시 띠인디기 도시 심주제 제바제도 아니면 질이야 다 강라에 마도 랑문의 주바 최소 자기는 민두아 선배기 타 줘버리디 레투거로 봐
that we can come to recognize that no phenomenon exists independently is through our understanding and application of our understanding of dependence arising. And we always start with explanations that are easy to understand, that from a seed, a sprout comes. Or to express it the other way, a sprout came from a seed. So we see the relationship of mutual dependency. Likewise, that a body came about in dependence on parents. Similarly, a state of not knowing something was eradicated and through the attainment of knowledge. Likewise, that attainment of knowledge came about in dependence on the acquisition of knowledge. We need to utilize this the understanding that we have and apply it broadly to recognize that there is nothing that exists that is not dependent. And we need to keep looking, keep investigating, not just merely accept this, but take every object of thought and remind ourselves, does this exist dependently or not? And when we recognize that it exists dependently, remind ourselves thereafter, therefore it is also empty of inherent existence. We can utilize this technique in relation to every single object of thought. Anything we're thinking about, see how that object is a dependent arising, and it is therefore empty of being independent or existing by way of its own nature.
그래서 나 저기 로 삼로 니수 신예기 로디게 차상 지간의 중국인데 나 저기 세부라 하고 해야지 가르는 나 소수기 가르네 장바에네 디 장바를 때네 아니 지금 랍칸지 여봐죠 랍칸디 장한지 장바 랍칸지를 때 랑기 배주의 제 장바 될라 때네 나 저기 니수디 신예기 로디 가세나 망아 레도라 베네 지금 labdra handa denma margin labdra ma terminal ya gaze lojo ma gaze chena kolya nisu xinye xingbi lodi jache roda da lobjong gyune majeje be zhongse ma jik tu lobjong gyune mehenjin kolya xingbi lodi nyunyu ma de 그래서 거 지전에 뒤에 때네 마장 바자 그 삼로 야게 두고 말 제가 개인질에 뒤 대라 때네 아니 장배게 소 배주 장발라 때네 로야게 조 윤데 지 망보 신기여 바딩아 저기 직세부로 지 차도고로 와다 제사 때네 용기여 바 어디 나신당 안 저기 나주요 냠네 집에네 당아 저기 곰 냠네 직제바제 심주 제발라 때네 아니 상주기 식당 계위식 내네 대소야 뭐 공대 표기여 바디 다 직바 차도고로 와 제사
All of you have a tremendous amount of knowledge and a wide variety of skills. You didn't come into this world with that knowledge and those skills. Rather, they were developed. They were developed through the accumulation of causes. So one went from a state of not knowing something to acquiring causes, leading to a state of knowing something. When we were little, we would have relied primarily on our caregivers, our parents, thereafter on our educators, in particular at school and university, and also in one's place of work. One is regularly learning new things, and from society in general, one is learning new things. And this means our level of knowledge is expanding. There are others in this world who are uneducated, perhaps illiterate, those living in very remote areas, and they certainly will have knowledge too that they acquired from their community. But compared to those living in a modern society, their knowledge is greatly limited. And why is there that? What accounts for that difference? The causes that have or have not been accumulated. Understanding that, we can apply it to the situation, our inner situation, in terms of the strength of our afflictions, the strength of our virtuous minds. These can change. Through acquiring knowledge and developing habituation, we can strengthen our habituation to a virtuous way of thinking and weaken our habituation to a non-virtuous way of thinking.
Rangun Juba Zawkini, Mindu, Sempike, Da said, Da Meva Tondu, Chesang Arzuka, Da said, Rawan, Nawana, she Mindu, Sempe, that Tondu, and the Garson, Rakata, Ranji to be Tomba, Tomba, you talk, Kansa Tame Tobara, Tomba, Tobara. Dito into Da said the Canisusin Pa, Chikna, the Pumbonga Pokan, Richile Paulu, Tabats and Mingi Pa, Tabats and Mitus, Yabat Mado, Rawan said the Mindu, said Tondu, Chesan, Kansati. 电前这话就话电这参谋多呀的，刚才的让我的这边东巴多的，刚才让新嘛做多把东巴一多，刚才让新嘛这边东巴一来的，一年刚才可能怕碰碰个不，刚才就略怕大把怎么样的，是早一年没把钱给买的，略大把怎么样把的，所以你说谈你说米路没làm的通路吧，就是刚才的民间大约就略怕碰碰个不，刚才就略大把怎么样把的这边多，但 刚才的刚来嘛，都让我们这边东北点多，东北也多，多人的刚才给点都电竞差不多呀的，刚才点都刚才东北让新嘛做多呀的，刚才西刚才这个点都点么你个有把的前面个把你都过了哇。
The final line of the verse, consequently, there is no self that exists. So the word's not there because the verses are brief, but the meaning is, consequently, there's no self that exists independently or inherently. So there's no self that is established by way of its own essence or is independent, despite appearing to consciousness as being so. Rather, the self is empty of inherent existence. Again, it's empty of existing by way of its own nature, despite appearing as if it is so. Not only is it that the self is empty of existing by way of its own nature, the self, though, does exist. How so? Merely labeled by mind onto the aggregates. Here, we're bringing these two understandings of emptiness and dependent arising together in relation now to the self. It's been presented earlier that this technique should be applied to all phenomena, and most importantly to the self. The self appears as being independent. We investigate, we recognize it's empty of existing the way that it appears. But it does still exist. How so? As merely labeled by mind onto the basis, which is the aggregates. And this is the realization, and in this way, through reflecting in this way with both emptiness and dependence arising, that one realizes the two truths onto a single basis.
Yes, then I'm going to get the Kansa said. 电竞这话穷话， 아니 풍봉아 보 간로라 때네 발로에 따바점 지마도 유바스도 간사 라시 마르바 동에도 아니 나주길이야 아니 녀모바 제디 아니 죽충줘야다 아니 용거리에서 숨거와 되네자 답변은 아주기 콘로시 사회나 당아주 콘로시 사회나 당아주 삼다네 콘로세디 콘르게 될이야 튀예로지 규 망고지 상고도와 다 당보 콘르게 규дел을 소소가 소소랑 콘로사바는 콘로세 규델라 안에 가르고고레세네 안 소소 당보 nga seba rang khonra se de rang chi zin ye samlo shu chen bo shi wo le ane nga la nyu so nga la chi chi di mi shen da chi ya ji di nga la nyu do se de an pa jo de khonra sa go ro je na khonra se de khonra sa se yu ji ku go yu me na khonra sa me ro je sa khonra sa se yu ji ku go re de ne an ji khonra se yu ji yo ba na pe yu ye na khonra lam sa se ge ma di gen ji che go re ana pa jo mi di ge chik na go chik du cha la ba na de la de ne gen khonra sa ya da de ne ki 넘줄래 때네 마디베긴 기 코르자 지선당 아주 코르사바이나 코르세유갈 미치레 코르사바이나 코르세기 유 데레 코르세기 긴现다직 최고도 안딜레야 유다 긴现의 최베네 소수규라 랑지진이 삼로 숙침부지 매바나 대한 코르세기요 말에 리트고 말 되네 자당 아주 코르 미치리아 직 미치기 안줄이야 직독자 랍제 고아제 소소 고아제 델라테니 미들베 지코로 사와나 다두스네 코로 사유 갑랑 안줄에 삼로드 나 세딩 아진이 슉침을 랑지 삼로드 슉침부 지여래 제상 랑지 되는가 랑디 디가서 가르삼다 랑세디 젠 칼라이 모테바 코롱 랑모니 두디 해지 직 시리여딩 진비 삼로 슉침부죠 니 이게인지 파줘들라 코로사 파줘 유디 코로사디 사디 갑라 미디 파요 미디 가르 통로서 미세디 당 미디 빼마시 강라마도 코롱 뭐는 줍디게 안에 쿠페 두자로지 통도 나와래 되니 통도 거봐 대상하는 절이 용거로와 나 동바 강사세디 တင်းကျင် 저와 좀 풍봉어 봐 강로질에 뛰네 따바sam직 다 안에 강사한테 랑 왜네 마주버지리에서는 또봐 강사 임반나 또 되바이나 데니게 삼로도 야메 랑치진기 삼로 슉쳔바데 용고 말에 파조 미디 안직베 강라마도 코롱문이 베 독자 휴진바디 랑문이 줍디게 독자 임바디에 로케야요마 요기요 말에 디마게도 콘로들이에요 레기요 말와 제산 디네자 콘르기에 튕긴데 마차도 규마차도 콘르기요 말 당안솔려도 제 삼다 콘르기에바나 콘르기 유 아니 소소라랑게 콘르기에 소소랑 귤에 랑체 삼로 슉쳔보 안 파조 통해 콘르자서 유디야 랑응원이 줍디게 베 초탐제는 베 야군 기네 매바르지 통디거와
As one continues to reflect on these teachings, integrating them within oneself, applying this integration in our daily life, we will become ever more familiar with the wisdom that realizes the emptiness of inherent existence and realizes that the way that phenomena exist is as merely labeled by mind. In particular, the person. That the person or the self is empty of inherent existence, but is merely labeled by mind. And as this understanding deepens within oneself, the ignorance of self-grasping weakens. The ignorance of true grasping weakens. And then, for example, so let's take, for example, right now, when anger arises, the consciousness of anger arises in dependence on causes. It's not independent, it is dependent. And at the root of the arisal of the consciousness of anger is the self-cherishing mind, or the ignorance of self-grasping. Right at the root is the self-cherishing mind. So, and probably what happens is, for anger to arise, another person has acted contrary to our wishes. And therefore, our self-cherishing rears itself and anger arises. And probably what is also required is some further other causes. For example, if this person is acting in a way that's contrary to our wishes, they will need to have done something or said something. So this person does or says something, our self-cherishing rises up because this is contrary to our wishes, what we want. We maybe see it as a threat to us physically, or a threat to what we want. And then, following the risal of our self-cherishing, anger comes, and directed at that person. And now, how do we see that person? We see them as an inherently existent enemy. Independent, inherently existent, by way of their own nature, they are an enemy. There's no doubt in our mind that this person is worthy of our wrath. So we take an illustration. Someone says something to us that we don't want to hear. It may be something harsh, it may be something untrue, it just may be something that is a view different to ours. And being something we don't want to hear, our self-cherishing rises up. It's much stronger than usual, and anger, serving the function of repelling what we see as bringing our independent, self-existent self harm, pushing them away. So here, at such a time, afterwards, we can look back at that instance and see how our self-cherishing arose, how we grasped strongly at an independent self, wanting things to go our way. Through training our mind by using such situations repeatedly over a sustained period, we'll become quite skilled in meditation at recognizing that the words that another person says are not inherently existent. The other person itself is not inherently existent. The arisal of any consciousness within us is a dependent arising. It's only come about in dependence on causes. We do not need to grasp at that, at the words of the other person, or at the other person themselves, because none of them exist in the way they appear. Nor does the self at the center of this whole saga exist in the way that it appears. Reflecting like this in meditation, the grasping mind, won't grasp so strongly at oneself, and therefore won't grasp so strongly at words that are said, the person that said them, or any resulting consciousness. And in this way, when we train well in meditation, and we gain ever more experience out of meditation, when we encounter particular circumstances that before would have set us off, now we can respond in a calm way, without getting upset at all.
That's also rangi tenjung chamata tongba ni rashin majuba to toba ina na mi shenda shenji ralia ve tsik tukja la kora la gi da chik benam yu tukja den tsik tukja la ba ine anda midi nga juge chike sam khartang resna da mi se di kor na midi koran dine la phe mi se di midi chik pumbong aba kanro chilpa tuyene haba da sha ba jinza da ba lo da ba zuyo wo ma yin da ran ngwe ne drup tu ba ji de me ba res jiza mi koran dine res jiza da midle ya nga koran sa go ka mi dus ko da chik zu ba la ba de chik zu ba de chik de ga de ges nga ne chele ne ding go res de la de ne yung go re de yang ga le de ne yung go res koran gyula sem da nyom ba da de ne gi sem 지게 녀모바다 콘롤라서 바드니기 마 코롱에 되바다 마튠베게 마 지금 마튠바지 되니기 되바 매비게 삼로 리어도 안델라 되니 중국어래 진짜 되네 중국어래 진짜다 미코롱래 제 녀모베게 지게 녀모보 콘트롤이 직계바 있나 델라 되는 직 두저 돼야다 류긴 넘겨 돼야지 인바레스고 거기가서 귤레 되네 제부도 용거로 와스 진짜 dine tungor cheza mikorola rawaskaya yo mares cheza ko nyombe wangi kigoro was cheza soso ine korola ba ina andi wangi tsiksu bada ane chike 동거 넘주 두자를 좀 차고 되네 인자 지산디 고 되네 인자다 분이 직직줄라이도 어디 라와 매바 셴 뇨모보기 제부레스 단 되네자 미기 꿰 미코롱기 꿰 마레스 다 미코 뇨모바디 꿰레스 남상 안주기 땡진 저와 좀 동반이 또 한기 로디기 용 가사디기 남사 되네 꿰디 뇨모비기 제부레 뇨모비 꿰 뇨모바디레 세비기 다 뇨모바디레 꿰 통용마도 가사디레 꿰 통고 말와 지산 뇨모바디레 꿰 통요도 그 뇨모바디 꿰 통고도 뇨모바디레야 안 파캅데 조제디 메바스요고레스 지든디 메바스요발라 카레스요고레스 파 코로나나 뇨모바디 메바스요고 말해 지산 파 잠제 두고 잠제 땅고레스 잠제 제배는 그 뇨모 콩레디 시투부레스 디니 인자 페기 버저기 디니기 삼다에도 안 팔이야 안 출리야 뇌비기에 직수보다 독지가 라베네 파 코로나에게 잡을이야 파쇼리야 잠바다 제와 라바도 잠바다 제와기야 잠바디 제와기에 용고래 예제로와 디니 인자 아니 데라 쇠바 라바도 번이 직수보다 독지라요 지산 쇠보 검토고라 지산 코로나나 쇠보 마토와와 지산 쇠보 검토고라 쇠베 냠는 빼마서 약보지 두고래 쇠베 냠네 약보야다 파쇼레 잠제 기토야다 라바도 디기토야다 책을 봐자 지산 동반이다 땡주에 남샤 참모디게 또 봐이나 아니 개판 되니기 용고래서 지산 내가 저게 람레미나 직전주에 냠는 나시에도 지산 교인지가 라리아 강아 제겐 토바이나 안델리아 학바르도 아니 배 직거린 첨보다 판도 첨보 랑게 판마다 개위신인 나신 따고래서도 뒤로 봐대 따고래서 냠는제 판마다 개위신인 나신 따고래서 강아 제겐 라리 교인지 네베진 전나 안델리아 거린 첨보다 개위신인 나신 따고래 생각도 아니 로정 갑라디 시거로 봐 제사 따고래서 김제 가르라나 델라 때네 하바다 인지 잠니지 게투야다 델라 쇠베냠네 약보 용고르와 제사다 기회 신인을 때네 가서는 아주 기회 신인이 아주 랍제제 안는 냠는 제월서 잠니지 고미하다 안는 쇠보 고미하다 말랍전치도 델라 때네 아주 냠는 제 아주 제 약보 용 투고르와 니나신 파죠 델라 때네 그 직수수다 두제제 견제 제바 델라 때네 아주 콜야 잠니지 곰투야 소수고 쇠보 곰투야 여봐 자자 기회신 롭장 라와 나신 코전 롭장 레고로 와다 된다 디르와 지상 동반이 다 땡중에 참모 또한 가사 되게라 신기 균주 제바이나 된데 용배나 안델리아 안 잠니 제게야나 안델리아 서버 검토야디 제부들라 다 동반이 땡중에 참모 또 비게 제부디 용고래 제루와다 당 아즈르나 남사 dim마도디 남사 추고란 남사 파 콩르라제 콩르 갑데 지자제 안에 증원의 증제 메와서야 삼당마도 잠니제 돈에 삼다디 용고 말와 가서 아즈르 동반이다 땡중에 남샤데 야고 검시다 또 마도바 인자 된 되네게다 동반이다 땡중에 남자 야고 켄디가 또 한디게라 안 되네 용 말에서
What I've just presented is how through this training we can respond to not get angry when others speak to us in a harsh way. Now to look at this a little further, let's say someone is angry with us, so they're not just expressing a view different to ours or doing something we don't like, but perhaps they are angry at us and they're speaking to us in a harsh manner. So invariably what happens is our self-cherishing arises, our pride arises. We stand up for ourselves and we give back as good as we get. Or if for whatever reason, perhaps we're intimidated and we say nothing, our mind is disturbed and remains disturbed for some time afterwards. If we've trained well though, our reaction will be vastly, vastly different. Because through coming to understand our own inner workings, we will understand the mind of others too, because we are not so different. We'll recognize that this angry person before us, perhaps with the red face and bulging eyes, that this person does not exist in the way they appear. Rather, the person is merely labeled by mind onto the physical and mental aggregates. That's all. Reminding ourselves of that, in the face of this adversity, we will relax. This person is not an enemy. They may appear to to my mind as such, independence on their words and their facial expression, and therefore I'm perhaps labeling them as such. That's all. They are not an enemy. Beyond, I am labeling them as such. Recognizing this, we relax. This person is not my enemy. Moreover, they are not harming me. No matter what they're saying or doing, because my mind now is relaxed and the afflictions are not arising, they are not harming me. How can I call them an enemy then? Moreover, in dependence on our extensive prior training, now with our mind remaining relaxed, we can also understand what is happening within their minds. So right now, their self-cherishing is in overdrive. They're grasping at a situation and they're wanting it to be in a particular way in accordance with their self-cherishing mind, and therefore all these afflictions are arising within them. Certainly, perhaps anger, maybe pride, perhaps, and almost certainly attachment too. So this person now is completely overwhelmed by their afflictions. They have no independence. They're not acting with any freedom at all. Rather, they are enslaved by their afflictions. How inappropriate it would be to be angry with them. How inappropriate it would be to even be disappointed in them. They have no freedom, have no control, but are a prisoner, bound by their afflictions. When the causes have been accumulated, the result will follow. And the causes, all these afflictions have arisen, and the results of their perhaps harsh speech will follow. Recognizing this now, we will not blame this person, we will not criticize them, we will not even be surprised. We will recognize the cause of all that is going on is their afflicted minds. And again, in dependence on all our prior training, we know that the skillful way to respond to an affliction such as anger is not with a response of anger, but with love and kindness. So here what we are seeing is how, through our training, we are coming to understand how phenomena exist in reality. And thereby, we are able to engage or interact with phenomena in accordance with reality. The phenomena here is the angry person before us. We're reflecting on the person, then their afflictions. And now we are able to interact or respond in accordance with reality. Can respond only with kindness and care to the suffering being before us. This way of responding comes about in dependence on extensive training on these teachings. And you'll know from your teachings in the Lama, a situation like this, and this person before one is likened to the kindness of our teacher or the kindness of our parents, in that in dependence on this person before us, we have the opportunity now to enhance our love, enhance our compassion, enhance our ethics, enhance our patience. This opportunity has only come about in dependence on this suffering being. And in this way, they are presenting an opportunity of great benefit to us. So what I've just presented here is very difficult to do unless one has trained well. If one has trained well, one has gained skill on the meditation cushion and started to gain skill off the meditation cushion too, then even in the face of great adversity, our virtuous minds will dominate and we will not harm others.
Dine zadabine tenjung chamato da tombani dohanchi yobaina susura nga sedine chik pumbonga bokhan palu pa ta pa samju yobamato nga sede tatun jene nyegine mindu samebadi sosugi sebu hakodeyorwa 지상 현지의 소소를 직수불라베나 나저에나 가선 나라데네 독자 랍송선 남상서 나라데네 독자 람송 나라네바 기소선 비 삼다제 콘란 거로 와다 지상 나세 삼데도 콘라야디 겐디 딜리오라 나세베 삼는 메나 나주 페지직 랍네 나라네서 나라 랍송 마삼반 나세 삼면 비 독자는 데 직독자라기도 삼마도 콘라야 말와 ngāla ngāla chik labsāng sāpa ngā samlo shukchimbulēdu pachō le kōna le korwa. Chisa tōngpa nī tā tēnchūnga namchā yāpa hākwa tōkhan dīgi na ngā sēdi pā pōngpō ngā pō kāngro chila lē pā tā pā tsamchī mā tō tā tōn tsēne nye gyūne mē pā chīnza tēne kī lō le ya tēne hāng chī shēr korwa. Shēdi pachō cik dukchā rā sōsā le cik tsūpa tā cik ngāmbar chī lāpa yīne ya ngā sēdi samlo shukchimbulī kō marwa. Mā le tū ngāla nyo sepe tsamcha lamsa pā kōnlāya di yunggō ma. Chisa sōsō yunggō ni tūngkīn di kāsa wā kōnlāya ki gyū di tsangō ma re. Mā sā tu kōnlā ki gō ma rwa.
Likewise, when one has meditated well on the self, recognizing that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, it has no inherent existence at all, but rather is imputed, the self is imputed onto the physical and mental aggregates by mind. That's all. So reflecting that that's how the self and all phenomena exist, our mind is relaxed and spacious, recognizing that results follow in dependence on causes, and therefore what appears to mind is just an arisal of dependency. Nothing that's appearing to mind exists inherently. Then, if someone speaks to us in an offensive manner, in an inappropriate manner, usually the ordinary response is the self-grasping arises, grasping at the me that is being affronted, that is being insulted. But if we're not grasping at ourselves in this way, recognizing that the self is merely imputed by mind onto the aggregates, then those words, who or what are they insulting? And in this way, our mind will be relaxed. And being relaxed, we can remind ourselves that the speech too, that too is a dependent arising, meaning is imputed by mind onto it. The person before oneself, whether they're an enemy or a friend, this too is dependent on imputation by mind. Nothing exists by way of its own nature. Thinking like this, they can say what they want. Our mind will stay relaxed and calm, and we will be able to respond with skill and with care.
Rāngshīngi mā chūpa, tēmbā chūpa, tōngpi kē, tōngpa, tōpa ina, tōngpa ina, tōpa ina, tēne kōngro mā lāngwā tāng, tī tsabli yā, wīshān liyā, jāmbā tāng tsēwā jītū yā, sūpi nyamna jītū wā tī yung kō rēs, tī nā yīn jīwā rā kōngro lī chāk pē shā pa mā tō, tī nā yī tuyā shā tāng, ngā yā tāng, chā sāng, o dōs chī nē, yung kō rēs, kia pār tēne kī yung kō rēs yā chī dōs chī.
Training in the way that we've been covering in these 15 pages, becoming ever more skilled in the understanding that first how phenomena appear, and secondly, they don't exist in this way, and thirdly, how they do exist as merely labeled by mind, we become spacious and calm, not drawn to things or repelled by things. And in this way, instead of an affliction such as anger arising when things don't go according to our wishes, we'll recognize that there is no self-existent I having wishes and insisting on things going our way. And thereby, whatever happens, our mind stays calm and spacious. Love and compassion can come forth from us in response to the suffering of others. And so I've used the illustration in these previous segments of anger, but it's the same with other afflictions, pride, attachment, and so forth. As we abide in accordance with reality, our afflictions subside, and we won't respond in an afflicted way because our afflictions are not arising. Now let's return to the text, the next outline. Looking at the first sentence here. If phenomena were not empty of an underlying basis or of their self-existence, it would be entirely impossible for the multiplicities of phenomena to be transformed in dependence on causes.
미동나 세도 모원이 유튜브에 있나 세우라 시자외네 자완네 랑 모원이 유튜브에 진배 있나 미동나 아니 최전 나서봐见了 되봐 포유를 제바 때니 미용 세대 지상 최전 변에 대화다 동화다 칠로고 숙자 지로 나서봐 최전 뒤시 최간지네 见显起了对你破旧교화 줘야 돼 때내 용어 말해서 그 라신 주도에는 니마 간지나 따라마도 교화 줘야 되는 용어 말해서지.
I read the sentence again. If phenomena were not empty of an underlying basis or of their self-existence, it would be entirely impossible for the multiplicities of phenomena to be transformed in dependence on causes. So this sentence is using some different words, but the meaning is as we've been covering. So the underlying basis or self-existence, previously in the text this was, the term that was used was if something existed by way of its own essence or existed by way of its own nature or inherently existent. So these terms, self-existence or underlying basis, it's just a different way of expressing the same meaning. So if phenomena were not empty of being inherently existent, for example, it would be entirely impossible for the multiplicities of phenomena. The multiplicities of phenomena, so consciousnesses such as happiness or suffering, or the various external objects of form, as well as those of sound and so forth, it would be entirely impossible for the multiplicities of phenomena to be transformed in dependence on causes. And as we've been hearing, the reasons why they would be impossible to be transformed if they were not empty of inherent existence is because they would exist inherently, and therefore they would be independent and would not be impacted by causes, because they would exist in a way that is independent of causes. What His Holiness here, what he's writing, is an expansion of what has been presented above in the quotations that we've been looking at this morning.
상한 송어 강도 줍냐 대라 주스 지에스 제가 더 당보 니네 시전에 당보 니네 줍줍바지 라시 랑응은 줍되어바지 여바 있나 랑은 줍줘바나 되는 상보세다 간보세다 뭐 간지시네야 그 당보는 줍되어바래 제가 소요다요 말 주스 지에 저겨다요 말해서
The text continues. If they existed by way of their own underlying basis, then no matter what type of entity they were, good, bad, and so on, how could they be altered? Again, this is as presented earlier. If something existed by way of its own entity, or if it were independent, it would be unchanging. Something good would remain so, something bad would remain so. There could be no change. Change would be impossible. And this paragraph concludes, if a beautiful fruit tree, for instance, were truly existent by way of its own entity or its own deep basis, how would it be true that it could regularly become ugly and bare like a staff?
나 전상 세능한 저 신약고지 델리아 제부 다셔바 지여바이나 제부도 되니게 전신 제부파 다시 제부 약보 다시 전신 약보디 랑궁원이 주드바시나 오암 폭자니네 데나세도 랑원이 라신이 주드바이나 라 규청 미두바시도 좋아 간에 된 세대 되네 신디 안에 봐 제보디 마사 고아사 로마디에 마사 안에 간부 주와해야지 차야지 용하야마 용바래 그디나 제보디 다지 전신이 지고 짠짠데 되되 그래서 제상고 데니게 로마 제보디에 마 메바자 로마디에 파사 사지 감라나 차야지 요 말에 자기 말에서 차요 말에서
So here we have, again, a different term, but the meaning's the same. If the fruit tree, for instance, were truly existence by way of its own entity or its own deep basis, before we had underlying basis, but the meaning is all the same, just different ways of expressing. That if, for example, a beautiful fruit tree were independent or existed by way of its own inherent nature or its own essence or were truly existent, it would be unaffected by, for example, causes. So how could fruit be born? How could that fruit on the tree ripen? And how could the fruit on the tree eventually fall off? Because being independent, it would be unchanging. It would be unimpacted by the causes that lead to that. Likewise, the leaves would never wilt and fall off the tree, and the tree could never become bare. That would be the consequence if phenomena existed independently.
나 가르송고르스는 아주 신ing주의 당보야 로마디바 예 근데 저 뭐팅디 장팅 이제 대리야 메도샤 닝주의 되는 바 제보다 아니 마제 강삼질야 또 제보디마 민차 차상소 되는 로마디에 바 감마사 되는 강삼질야 아니 지기 야가 춘주디에 마 고아전 되는 신디 감제 감부 교과 하나지 차도에 아주 미기 통야도 와서 월당은 통구도 와서 제가 디 유어루도 와서 당보 바베 롱오신칭지 로마르게 메도게 닝주부차 되는 제보다 되는 마제는 제보디 마사 고사 되는 저 로마디게 닝바차 세워치 마사 되는 마사는 가슴질이야 야가디게 파자 차저 아니 교과 동보 그런 감보 해야지 차도 받은 아주 미기 통구도 와 제가 신도 유어루도 와서 제가 현지 지질을 뛰는 유어루도 와서 제가다 데니기 전신인지보다 강라마도 랑원이 줍도바이나 유어균을 줘야 말이에요. 제상 유어 주고 여바든 한 종원숨 통도와 제상 현래 뛰는 주바래. 제상 강라마도 랑원이 줍에 전신세다 매바래 사지. 너던다지 송거와.
We see illustrations of this each and every day, looking out of the window now, coming here earlier, going home in a little while. We see illustrations of dependency all around us. It is spring. The flowers are blooming. The trees are full of leaves. But this wasn't the case a short while ago. And in weeks to come, it will all be a little different. We see this around us all the time, these illustrations of dependency. We need to take these as reminders that what we're seeing now has not always been like this. And this shows that phenomena do not exist by way of their own nature, but are empty of existing by way of their own nature, or dependent rather.
Savi Sikteshi Papa Shival Papa said Shival Zeba Gala Dine Junior by Dine Rangam Euro said Chishenchila Dune Juba in the Rawan Juba to check Maries, Rawan the Juba and the Yotra Mares Silva, Chesan Dichibari that Jenshi the year Jeninji would Jenshi the Rawan the Juba ina and the Yotra Mares. 제산 유어 두고 여바된 건 미기 동도 와서 가서 고도 선인지고 참매도셔 지보다 되는 로마사 되는 바 행동 바 야가데 바 교바 감보 해내지 차바데 먼저 미기 동도 유어 두고 와서 제산 라왕 매바레스 라왕도 마주바레스 제산 라왕 마주바레스 라왕도 두바네 유어 줘야 말레스 대시 자위치기 돈다디레다 돼서
This line here relates very closely to the quotation immediately above from Aradeva's 400 verses. Whatever exists dependently, it is not independent. As everything lacks independence, consequently, there is no self that exists. Here we can see these illustrations of change around ourselves, and therefore we can recognize that no phenomenon is self-existent, or to put it literally, has freedom. The phenomena may appear to our mind as having freedom, but no phenomenon does. So again, just to say, self-existence or freedom is or self-powered, all the same word. But we utilize these. I repeat the different translations just because they give a different feeling or flavor in relation to the varying objects. So when we look at the natural world, and we see change, we must recognize that this is a sign that phenomena are not independent, but are dependent, and therefore empty of inherent existence. Consequently, looking at the verse, there is no self that exists inherently. There is no tree or anything in the natural world either that exists by way of its own nature.
제자다 상보다 남바도 교조요 바된 가지기 통해 도와지 올다 집에네 진당보 지단미 상보를 미로시네 상보시네 야 진감바지 체시네 야 디지네 민감바 베네가 밀리아 뇌스시야다 되네기 차야 용고로 와야 당보야 미디야 직배 공로 쳐보다 지게 되네야 리네 야 가서 야지 교와 되지 미디배 마세 상보다 미야고 차야 돼 용고로 바된 가도 통치수교 봐 요로 봐 밀리 집에네 대신 나신 신노를 비시네 신나다 본인주 배 야고 집에네 야고 집에네 다 신노 상보 집에네 디바 로마디게 파사 감디네 간섬지라 감부 전 닝버 차네 네 지금 되수 야매바 차 규조해 거래 당보 양 신디게 배 감르라다 지 로마데 지교베네 양 차바라 지 류레 다에 델야 된 지금 양 로마데 다 메도라샤 근데 닝지고 차려 그래서 남바다 상보도 규어줘도 그래서 규어줘요 봐서 라와도 마주바래 라와도 두비에다 규어줘요 말해 그래서 차상게 당 안주기 통추주 규비기 신다 상보당 규어줘요 같은 간지 통구도 되는데 통구도 없으면 더야라 그래서 되는 인자 강라마도 라와도 마주바래 챤도 되는 주바래서 어디 숨어로다.
Just before I start, just bear in mind these different translations for the same term. Freedom, self-existence, or self-powered. Okay, now to come to Genla's presentation. Let's go back to the previous sentence where we see that, let's see, no matter what type of entity they were, good, bad, and so on, how could they be altered? So let's think a little bit more about this. Good and bad. Good and bad comes about independent on causes. Whatever is good because it has come about independence on particular causes, and whatever is bad too has come about independence on causes. There is no freedom here. There is also no self-existence. Likewise, from the side of the perceiving consciousness, that something is perceived as good or as bad, that too has come about independent on causes. That something is liked or disliked, good or bad, liked or disliked, comes about independent on causes. Something isn't inherently good or bad. Something isn't inherently perceived as good or bad. Both the object and the perceiving consciousness come about independent on causes. Because they come about independent on causes, there is no freedom. And when we say that there is no freedom, this is not how we often recognize or relate to things. Hence, we are so often surprised. We can be surprised when a kind-hearted person is angry. We are surprised when an angry person is kind. All that's happened is independent on a particular set of causes. A certain result has come. That's all. So again, that we are surprised shows that we perceive the object as being independent, inherently existent, not impacted by causes and conditions. So this is something we should reflect on. Both the object and the way we perceive it, both the object and the way we perceive it, come about in dependence on causes and conditions. And therefore, some people will see something as good, others will see that same thing as bad. Not surprising. In dependence on whichever set of causes have been accumulated, things are perceived in a certain way. So this bears further and deep reflection.
Sibin Mambora get Casawara Shake Kala Chivana. The Kala de Shimburibe Shimbu Mares, Tibetan, Michi Lituatan, Michi, the Kala de Shimbu Lagrova, Michi sometimes Michi, the Kala de Shimbu Mare Lagrova. Chizan Kala de Chigi Shimbu Lare, Chigi Shimbu Mevara, Shimbu Yomarelare. Coin the Sud Dembares. That the Sud Tashi, that the Sud Dembares, Shimbu Me Lacandia, Corona, Dembara Chago, Dembare. 신부 열라게 덴바레 니가 덴바로 와다 이내 신부 찌기 신부 열라게 찌기 신부 매야 되니 가다로 와 그러니까 니가 영화 차이 다 칼라디 신부대 신부 봐 니가 레벨라네 니가 레랍 투여요 말로 와
Take an illustration. If we eat a meal, we can readily determine whether it's a delicious meal or not a delicious meal. And quite clearly, a meal cannot be both delicious and not delicious, because that would be contradictory. A meal is going to be delicious or it's going to be not delicious. But let's take a meal that has been prepared with a lot of chili. To some, that will be a delicious meal. To others, it will be inedible. But if the meal were independent, the food was independent, it couldn't be both delicious or it be perceived as both delicious and inedible. And the person who finds it delicious, is their viewpoint in accordance with reality? Or the person who finds it inedible, is their viewpoint in accordance with reality? So this too is important to think about.
This is Kala Katsubu, that Shimbuchi, Shimbu Yorela, Chigi Shimbu Mevarale, that do sometimes that could Shimbu Yorela go the Karalitene Shimbu Yorela Gore, Chigi Shimbu Mer like the Karalitene Shimbu Mer Lagores, two to Shimbu Chedu Kabla, and the Cheba Chebaina, Shimbu Yorela went the Shimbu Yores, Karasene, Katsu Bear words, the Kalaigi, Katsubu, George, Yodi, Katsubu, George, Horse Kigurova. 디 데니게 초와딜래야 코론 데바 버구 얼와다 데니 카세 칼라 카스보 조지뇨디 데니게 초와지게도 데니게 초와딜래야 소수기 데바디 델이야 가부중고 데바 기고로와 소수 데바 기와 연장 초와딜래 데바 기와 연장 초바기 초와기지게 안에 칼라딜라 신부요레스 야고요레스 다다레 돈다라 닝보 돈다 삼다야디 코롱게 카소부 칼라 카소부디 제르파 뇽에도 델로 초와지기걸 초와델로 코롱 가르와 초와데 칼라 마르와 칼라게 조 뇽에게 초와 뇽 초와디 칼라 마레데 이네 칼라게 조 뇽 초와델파 코롱 가제네 데니기 아니 유게 칼라델야 신보여래 약보여래서 봐 떼거래 다 직디 신부메 라간디 가르스는 칼라데요다 카소불런도 초 데니게 초와델라 가고 말다 초와데 마가 데니게 초와레도 초와데 마가 와인자 지초와 용야기 규기엔 용사기 칼라데야 신보여 말했어요. 제가 돈다 닝보데 소수기 되바데 가르서는 초와델라 가와인자 지디 약 칼라데 약보 칼라 가와 차소와 칼라 신보여 따소와 제가 칼라 코롱게 랑고네 신부 심심지 돈다 ngo네 룸민도하다 신부디 신부레 신부 룸민도와 제가 코롱게 초와델야 가제 초와데 용야기 기엔데 칼라데 제바 델라틴의 초와지게 초와대로 써서 가부 용화에서 아니 가와인자 아니 칼라디 신부요래서 봐 뢰봐 신부요래서 봐 따셔버려. 다 직부디기 칼라디기 용화도 초와대 써서 가서부 초와대 용화 초와들 그게 매려와 초와대 마가와인자 초와기 용사 끼인지서 칼라디를 신부요 말했으니 칼라디를 봐 신부 니가기 돈다 닝바디 니가 소소랑 초와대게도 직디 소소랑 초와대 가고 직디 초와대 가고 말해. 소와들 가고 말 돈다 디레데 이네야 그 소와디 야고민도 레그민도와 이나 칼라디 신부요 말에 신부요래서 따야디 데니게 소와디 깨봐 가마가 끼인제네 칼라디 신부요래 신부요 말에서 따기도 와
There's hot food, there's food that's been prepared with a lot of chili. Again, two people are sharing this meal. One finds it delicious and the other inedible. So whose experience is in accordance with reality? Whose opinion is in accordance with reality? Well, what is determining whether whether this meal is perceived as delicious or not is dependent on what is happening in the inner world, the consciousnesses of the two people eating the meal. For one, there is the heat or the composition of the meal is interacting with their tongue sense consciousness and in dependence on a wide range of causes that person has previously accumulated. That meal is perceived to be delicious, perhaps just like Mum made it. For the other person, in dependence on a wide range of causes, that same meal is found to be inedible. And whether they respond with this is fabulous or this is awful depends on whether attachment for the meal has arisen or whether repulsion towards the meal has arisen. And what immediately precedes the attachment or the repulsion? Not the food, but another consciousness. Consciousness of feeling. So if the feeling is a pleasant feeling, a feeling of happiness, attachment will follow for the food. If the feeling is a suffering feeling, a dislike, then repulsion, pushing that meal away, will follow. So therefore, whether the meal is enjoyed or not is dependent immediately on the arisal of a feeling. And the arisal of the feeling comes about, of course, in relation to the food, but also many other causes can impact on what feeling arises in relation to that food. Here we can, by thinking like this, we can recognize that from the side of the object, this meal, there is no independent nature. If it were independent, if it had existed by way of its own nature, in other words, inherently existent, or existed by way of its own essence, everyone would perceive it in the identical way. But that same meal is perceived very differently. The food, the meal, cannot be independent or exist by way of its own nature or essence. And likewise, or again, one's own experience of that meal comes about first, immediately on the arisal of a particular feeling. Then we'll label it as delicious or not. And that feeling comes about in dependence on a wide variety of causes as well. So this is important again to reflect on.
칼라디 심마레스는 유코롱원의 줍디비기 심보다 심마이버스 줍디야지 민도와 세상은 심보다 심매가 세디 아주기 직초와질게 될라 때네 발뢰 파심도 심민도세 발로 따바점마도 다 칼라랑 원에 심심세 줍디야지 민도와서 거든
Reflecting on this, we can see that the food cannot be independent. Yet that is how we relate to it. Hence our surprise when someone doesn't like something that we like. Moreover, we need to reflect on this to see the sequence of arisal. That we label something in a particular way, independent on a variety or sequence of minds. First, a feeling of pleasant or unpleasant arises, then attachment or aversion towards the meal arises, and we label this meal as delicious or inedible. This sequence is also important to recognize.
그 간대치나고 라신디 가서 라신이 주변 동바들레스 디 동바니디 우인니스디 최탐지를 우인니스디 간라마도 랑군이 주변 동바들레스 동바니들레스 세상에서 나는도 갈라 간라마도 랑군이 난고래 디나와나 신지요 말레스 세상 우인니스디 신고야디 간라마 랑군이 주변 동바레스 디 동바디 하고야라 간데스 하고 그래서는 아주 바 심주지 지질의 땡진 저와 준비 금전들레데 땡기도와 디네 땡기도와 디마데나 디메바 차도와 세베당한 저기 또 전에 심주 땡땡되게 되게 삼바 나이도 근데 그도 심주체도 되네 강 최간의 신에 강라에 마도버 강 직전제 뛰는 주바 잠 하고요도 강라에 마도 랑원도 주바사지 자기는 민도 세베게 네 하고 두그리스 디 하고요도 아니 땡진 저와 중화나 동바인 남샤데 하고 거래 디 하고도 디로딩아 줄에 끼어도 델라테네 아 저기라 아니 장주 셈냠렌지야다 잠니지 고미알아서 받아 셈슈 얼마 하바도 아니 닝도피야다 안디 냠렌지야래 베주 야고체토야 아니 디제발레테네 타바다 탐지기 보고 봐 다니어 줘도야 지상아서 동아세 투야다 디기 주토야 되네게 셈기 때문에 주다니 텐션 거래서 제사당 저기 데니기 땡이 주바잠 짐르파 따바잠 짐마도 데지 칼라 삼도 진짜 칼라 코롱원이 심다 미심세 민도 디파르파 따바잠이 차도 왔으면 삼게다 디나신 현기 뇌버기다 데니기 지시 유 통의 체베네 제사 곧 현을 뛰네 그 따바를 되네 그 두스레샤 된자 미코랑을 랑와스카요 말에서 비기텔이야 한샤리 니제 하버디야다 소고메 컴투야데 컴투야 용고레스 디 소시기 쇠베 냠렌지야다 잠니제 냠렌지야 장주심 냠렌지야다 진소 80주발라서 냠렌제디 디소영아 주기 띵게 대화 토역이 대위 규티샤고래 제산 디 삼로디게 되네 가제 야가 차tum내가 주기 아니 기디나 대화네 세대레네 대화 뭐번에 대화 아니 서버 타바다 탐지기 보고봐 상유고봐 띵이 대화 토역이 아니 규티샤고래스 델레데네가 주기 동아세야다 아니 디기 주역이 두시는 용고래세지 당한저 돈다닝보데 두시네 데네 인사당아 주기 가르치고래서 당아 주기다 nga yang ne yang du dian jin zhe wa ju yue dang bo nga zu 균지기 땡데 디기파 땡디기 남자디파 제바시 삼다 안 되는 디나시 안 가서 땡네 답에 땡데 보도 삼다 되는 그 생각도 나 세야데세도 나서 나타야 나세 간지 능도 나와나시 나세데 간지 치는 순고 간지 용도 또 심주시에데 저기 야네야도 삼다 제바제고야데 맞을게 제모 제고래 당아서 되네 제바제바네 아니 그시 남시 세상 나중에 다 저기 땡데 또야다 동반이 또야기 고갑자라기로 와다 고 제바지기 제다 야야야야기 루로 와다
I hope you have plenty of food for thought to apply to your meditations over the next fortnight until we meet again. Especially what we've just looked at now, seeing how and why things are labeled as wanted and unwanted, good and bad, and so forth. So what I encourage you how I encourage you to approach your meditations is to reflect on dependent arising and emptiness, and then emptiness and dependent arising, recognizing how phenomena appear to consciousness as being independent, as being self-existent, as under their own power, or in other words, as having freedom. But when we seek them out, we cannot find any nature or essence by which they exist, and therefore they are empty of existing in the way that they appear. We realize emptiness. Thereafter, we recognize that whilst they are empty of inherent existence, they do exist. How so? As a dependent arising. Dependent on causes, parts, imputation by mind. We also then reflect that, so that's the one approach where you first reflect on emptiness, thereafter on dependent arising. Then you can turn that around. That phenomena, every object of thought is a dependent arising. It's come about in dependence on causes and parts and imputation, and therefore it is empty of existing inherently. Cannot exist by way of its own nature because it's a dependent arising. So here, whatever your object of meditation is, you're recognizing first that has come about in dependence on causes, parts, or imputation, and therefore it is empty. So the first technique was to first recognize that a phenomenon doesn't exist in the way that appears, and therefore it's empty. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It exists as a dependent arising. Then to turn it around, you reflect that first on dependent arising. That phenomena exist as dependent arisings, and therefore they are empty of inherent existence. And then just in our summary, so that's the approach to take in meditation. Then we also covered this weekend that as one becomes more familiar and more skilled, and through developing the wisdom understanding emptiness, and especially when one is experiencing the benefit of this meditation, not just in meditation session, but in our daily life, this serves to strengthen our love and compassion because we recognize that I am changing and I can continue to change. I have the ability to do this. It's not merely a theory that I can overcome my afflictions. I can eradicate them, and I'm experiencing their weakening in strength. Therefore, I can become a Buddha for the sake of those who are suffering far worse than I am, those who have yet to spiritually develop and develop these skills within them. And this then serves to strengthen our love and compassion and our determination to strive for Buddhahood. And the third point to make in the summary is that as we gain skill in the cultivation of wisdom, when we observe others or we interact with others, and we recognize and are mindful or aware of our inner workings, our own inner process, we may then be aware of our self-cherishing mind arising when things don't go in accordance with our wishes. And recognizing this process of dependency, we can let go. No, not grasp at the situation, not grasp at ourselves. And in this way, our mind can stay undisturbed, in the face of adversity. Moreover, we can also recognize that if we are interacting with someone else, that this is an ordinary person. And if they are now acting under the influence of anger, or attachment, or pride, it's not surprising. When the causes are accumulated, the result will follow. And if there's a long habituation with the causes, as will be the case, then those results are of course going to continue to arise. Recognizing this, compassion for this person who has no freedom, who is being controlled by their afflictions, who is controlled by their ignorance that has deceived them, and they think that they are free and making choices, but their afflictions are dominating them. This too keeps our mind relaxed and spacious, patient, and allowing love and compassion to abide. And these minds, patience, love, and compassion, are causes for our own happiness, and they enable us to respond in accordance with reality. In other words, respond in a way that will benefit someone, not in a way that is discordant from reality when our mind is dominated by the afflictions. Training like this, repeatedly over a sustained period, we'll recognize that every object of thought, despite appearing as being independent, is dependent, and therefore is empty of inherent existence. And that relates to the self as well as the objects of thought. When we become ever more skilled to go about our day, we can be aware of whatever we are thinking about, remind ourselves that object, that situation, this person, whatever it may be, doesn't exist in the way that it appears. It is a dependent arising. It is empty of existing inherently. And so too is the self who is thinking these thoughts. The person, as well as the thought and the object, all three spheres, are empty of inherent existence. So thank you. And then we'll continue from this second bullet point on page 15 next week. Thank you.